Hello, dreamers. I'm the Success Dreamer. These stories are here to inspire you while you fall asleep. If they bring you peace and motivation, please like the video and subscribe. Now, breathe deeply, relax, and enjoy the story. Tonight, as the rain falls softly outside your window, let me tell you a story. This is not just any story. It is a story of success. A story of a man who began with almost nothing, no wealth, no privilege, no guarantees, and yet changed the way millions of people live, work, and dream. This is the story of Steve Jobs. Why do we tell stories like this? Because they remind us that greatness is not reserved for the lucky few. It is built step by those who dare to dream, who dare to be curious, who dare to begin even when they are uncertain. This is not only the story of Steve Jobs, it is also a mirror. It is meant to inspire you, to remind you that your beginnings do not define your destiny. Steve was born in 1955 in San Francisco. His mother was young and unprepared, and so she gave him up for adoption. To some, that might have seemed like a disadvantage. But to Steve, it became a unique beginning. He was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, an ordinary couple with no wealth, no fame, but with a promise to give him love and opportunity. Paul Jobs worked with his hands. He repaired cars, built furniture, and taught young Steve that anything worth doing was worth doing well. He told his son, even the back of the cabinet, the part nobody will see, should be made beautiful. Steve carried this lesson all his life. True excellence is found in the details, even the ones hidden from view. In school, Steve was restless. He asked questions others ignored, challenged rules, and often felt misunderstood. Teachers saw him as difficult, but curiosity was his gift. As a teenager, his fascination with electronics grew. He took apart radios, experimented, failed, and tried again. Each mistake taught him something new. It was during these years that Steve met Steve Wozniak, a kind and brilliant young man. Woz could design circuits with ease, while Jobs had vision and relentless energy. Together, they became friends, spending long hours tinkering, building, and dreaming. Here is the first lesson from this story. Success does not begin with certainty. It does not require wealth. It begins with curiosity, with the willingness to learn, and sometimes with the right friend who shares your dream. At this point, there was no fame, no fortune, only two young men in a garage, following curiosity. But beginnings do not need to be grand to lead to greatness. This is the story of Steve Jobs. This is the story of success. And if he could begin with so little, then so can you. After high school, Steve Jobs enrolled at Reed College in Oregon. His parents had promised his birth mother that he would go to college, and they sacrificed much to make it possible. But tuition was expensive, and within months, Steve realized he was draining their savings. He wasn't inspired by most of his required classes, and so he made a bold decision. He dropped out. On the surface, it looked like failure. No degree, no direction. To many people, dropping out would have seemed like closing a door. But Steve didn't see it as the end, he saw it as freedom. Without the burden of mandatory courses, he could focus on the things that truly fascinated him. Though he left formal enrollment, he continued to drop in on the classes that sparked his curiosity. Life during this period was not easy. Steve had no dorm room of his own. He slept on the floors of friends' rooms, often curled up with little more than a blanket. He returned empty Coke bottles for spare change, just to buy food. On Sundays, he would walk 7 miles across town to the Hare Krishna temple for a free meal. These were humbling days, stripped of comfort and security. Yet Steve never complained. He later said that hunger and hardship taught him resourcefulness, discipline, and appreciation for the simplest things. Among the classes he chose to attend was a calligraphy course. It was unlike anything else, elegant, artistic, and deeply human. He learned about typefaces, kerning, spacing, and how the smallest details of design could change the way something felt. At the time, he thought it had no practical use. But years later, when he was leading the team that created the Macintosh, those lessons returned to him. He insisted that their computer should not only function, but also present text with beauty and grace. This decision transformed the way people interacted with computers. Today, every modern computer and phone carries that influence. The lesson here is powerful. Nothing you learn is ever wasted. The skills, experiences, and even detours that feel random may one day connect in ways you cannot yet see. Jobs would later explain, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward. At Reed, he could not have predicted how calligraphy, hunger, and long walks for food would shape his vision. But those struggles planted seeds that later grew into innovations which touched the entire world. His time at Reed was not about a degree. It was about learning to trust curiosity, to find value in unlikely places, and to embrace uncertainty. While the world saw a dropout, Steve was quietly building a foundation. He was learning that the path to success does not have to be straight. It can bend, twist, and still lead to greatness. The Apple I was just the beginning. In 1977, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak introduced the Apple II, and this time, it wasn't just for hobbyists. It was sleek, packaged, and ready for ordinary families, schools, and offices. Unlike other computers that looked intimidating, the Apple II felt welcoming, bright, colorful, and accessible. For the first time, computers began to leave the laboratories and enter living rooms and classrooms. Apple wasn't simply selling machines, they were opening a door to the future. Teachers saw the potential for learning. Businesses saw tools for productivity. Families saw a glimpse of what was coming. Sales exploded. By the early 1980s, Apple was a rising star in Silicon Valley. Jobs, still in his 20s, suddenly found himself leading a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The garage days were behind them. Apple now had offices, employees, and growing influence. But success did not make Steve comfortable. He wasn't content with Apple just being another technology company. He believed computers could be more than boxes that process numbers. They could be personal companions, tools that felt alive, machines that blended technology with art. This vision led to one of the boldest projects Apple would ever attempt, the Macintosh. Unlike other computers of its time, the Macintosh had a graphical interface, icons, and a mouse. It was friendly, playful, and simple to use. For Steve, it was the embodiment of his philosophy. Technology should be elegant, intuitive, and human. The launch of the Macintosh in 1984 was unforgettable. Jobs unveiled it on stage with pride, his passion filling the room. The famous commercial aired during the Super Bowl, declaring that Apple would free people from the conformity of the old computing world. The crowd erupted in applause. For a moment, it seemed as though the Macintosh had changed everything. And yet, reality was more complicated. The Macintosh was beautiful, but it was also expensive and limited in power. Sales didn't match the hype, and Apple soon faced challenges. Critics questioned Jobs' leadership, saying he was brilliant but demanding, inspiring but difficult. Still, the Macintosh planted a seed. It set a new standard for design, inspiring future generations of technology. Even in its struggles, it represented a bold leap forward. The lesson from this chapter is clear. Success is not a straight line. Even great ideas face obstacles. Even visionaries encounter setbacks. What matters is the willingness to dream bigger, to push past what already exists, and to take risks when others settle for safety. Steve Jobs was not afraid to take that risk. The Macintosh may not have been perfect, but it was a glimpse of the future, a future where computers would feel less like machines and more like extensions of our imagination. By the mid-1980s, Apple had grown from a garage dream into a company worth billions. Steve Jobs was no longer just a young innovator. He was a celebrity in the tech world. But with success came tension. Jobs was brilliant, but he was also demanding, perfectionistic, and relentless. His passion drove Apple forward, but it also clashed with colleagues and executives who saw him as difficult to work with. The Macintosh, though groundbreaking, was not selling as well as Apple had hoped. Inside the company, pressure was building. The board of directors, along with the CEO John Sculley, the very man Jobs had recruited from Pepsi, believed Steve was too unpredictable to lead. And in 1985, at only 30 years old, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he had founded. Imagine what that felt like, to be fired from your own creation, to watch something you built with your heart and soul continue without you. Jobs later said that at the time, it was devastating. For months, he felt lost, humiliated, and uncertain of what came next. To the world, he had gone from a genius to a failure almost overnight. But here is where the story turns. Instead of letting failure define him, Steve decided to begin again. He started a new company called Next, focused on building advanced computers. He also purchased a small animation studio that would one day become Pixar. At first, neither venture looked like success. Next struggled to sell computers, and Pixar spent years searching for a breakthrough. But through those struggles, Jobs was learning to manage, to trust others, and to see beyond the short term. Looking back, Jobs would later say that being fired from Apple was the best thing that could have happened to him. It freed him from the weight of success and gave him space to rediscover his creativity. Sometimes life pushes us down, not to end our journey, but to force us to grow in ways we never would have otherwise. The lesson here is profound. Failure is not final. The moments that seem like the end may in fact be beginnings in disguise. Steve's dismissal from Apple could have destroyed him. Instead, it planted the seeds of his greatest achievements. When he spoke years later at Stanford University, Jobs told graduates, "Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith." He knew this not as theory, but as lived truth. Failure is part of every success story. What matters is what you do with it. By the mid-1990s, Apple was in trouble. The company that once sparked excitement had lost its way. Competitors were innovating faster, Apple's products were scattered and confusing, and the spark that once defined the brand seemed to be fading. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs was quietly building in the background. Next, though not a commercial success, had developed powerful software admired by many in the industry. Pixar, the animation studio he had nurtured, had begun to shine. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first full-length computer-animated film. It was a triumph, proving not only that technology could create art, but that Jobs still had the ability to back bold, world-changing ideas. Apple, desperate for innovation, looked to Next for help. In 1997, Apple acquired Next, and with it, Steve Jobs returned to the company he had once been forced to leave. It was a full-circle moment. The man who had been cast out was now back, called upon to save the very company that had rejected him. When Jobs walked back into Apple, the situation was dire. The company was losing money, morale was low, and critics predicted its collapse. But Steve had a gift, the ability to see not just what was wrong, but what could be. He began simplifying Apple's chaotic product line, focusing only on the essentials. He pushed for design, clarity, and user experience above all else. He also forged bold partnerships. In a surprising move, Jobs announced a collaboration with Microsoft, Apple's old rival, securing vital funding and software support. Many were shocked, but Jobs wasn't interested in rivalry for its own sake. He cared about survival and vision. Under his leadership, Apple launched the Think Different campaign. It celebrated rebels, misfits, and dreamers, the very people Jobs had always admired. The message was clear: Apple wasn't just selling computers. It was selling a way of thinking, a belief in creativity and individuality. Slowly, Apple began to revive. New products were on the horizon. The culture was shifting. And Steve, once considered too difficult to lead, was now the anchor guiding Apple back to life. The lesson of his return is powerful. Redemption is possible. Even if you are cast out, even if the world doubts you, you can come back stronger. Failure had humbled Steve, but it had also sharpened him. He returned not just as a visionary, but as a leader who knew what truly mattered. Life rarely moves in a straight line. Sometimes, the very doors that close on us are the ones we will walk through again, more prepared, more resilient, and more determined than before. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he knew saving the company would take more than cutting costs or reorganizing teams. Apple needed a spark, a product that would remind the world of what made it special in the first place. That spark came in 1998 with the launch of the iMac. It was unlike any computer people had seen before. At a time when most machines were dull, beige boxes, the iMac was bright, colorful, and playful. Its translucent case revealed its inner workings, giving it personality. Apple offered it in bold shades of blue and later in green, orange, purple, and more. It was a machine that looked alive. But the iMac was more than looks. Jobs pushed for simplicity. Setting up a traditional computer was frustrating, with endless cords, manuals, and confusion. The iMac reduced all of that. It was designed to be approachable, almost friendly. You plugged it in, turned it on, and it just worked. This was technology for everyone, not just for offices or specialists. The reaction was immediate. Customers lined up. Sales skyrocketed. Apple, which had been teetering on the edge of collapse, suddenly had momentum again. The iMac wasn't just a product, it was a statement that Apple was back, stronger and more daring than ever. Inside the company, the mood shifted. Employees who had once felt discouraged began to believe again. Apple was no longer fighting for survival, it was leading with imagination. The iMac restored confidence, both within Apple and in the eyes of the public. The success of the iMac also proved a bigger idea: Design is not decoration. Jobs believed design was about how something works as much as how it looks. The iMac was evidence of this philosophy. It wasn't only beautiful, it was functional, approachable, and inspiring. It connected with people emotionally, turning computers from cold machines into personal companions. This chapter of Apple's story reminds us that sometimes revival begins with one bold move. You do not need to fix everything at once. You need to choose one thing, focus deeply, and make it excellent. The iMac was that focus, and through it, Apple rebuilt its foundation. The iMac was more than a computer. It was a new beginning, a declaration of identity. It told the world that Apple was not finished. In fact, it was only getting started. By the early 2000s, Apple was back on its feet. The iMac had revived excitement, but Steve Jobs was not content to stop there. He understood that true innovation was not about improving what already existed, it was about creating something people didn't even know they needed. And in 2001, he set his sights on music. At the time, music was messy. People carried CDs, bulky players, or used complicated software to manage digital files. The experience was frustrating, fragmented, and uninspiring. Steve believed it could be simpler. He asked a bold question: what if you could carry your entire music library in your pocket? The answer was the iPod. Sleek, white, and elegant, the iPod was unlike anything the world had seen. Its design was minimal yet iconic, with a simple click wheel that made navigating thousands of songs effortless. And its promise was revolutionary: 1,000 songs in your pocket. The iPod didn't just change how people listened to music. It changed their relationship with it. Suddenly, music was always with you, ready to match your mood, your walk, your life. People no longer thought of music as something stored on shelves or tied to devices. It became personal, portable, and alive. But Steve knew the iPod alone was not enough. He introduced iTunes, a platform that allowed users to purchase individual songs legally and easily. At a time when piracy was rampant, Apple gave the music industry a lifeline. More importantly, it gave people a way to enjoy music without guilt or hassle. The cultural impact was massive. The iPod became more than a gadget. It became a fashion statement. Its white earbuds were instantly recognizable, symbols of modernity, youth, and individuality. People danced with them, walked with them, lived with them. The iPod wasn't just selling music, it was selling freedom. For Apple, the iPod marked a turning point. No longer was the company just a computer maker. It was now a cultural brand, a company that blended art, technology, and lifestyle into one. The iPod planted the seeds for a future where Apple would shape entire industries, not just participate in them. The lesson of the iPod is clear. True innovation solves problems people didn't even realize they had. Most companies at the time focused on making CD players smaller or MP3 players slightly better. Steve Jobs imagined an entirely new way of experiencing music. He didn't just improve the present, he created the future. And as people walked through cities and streets with white earbuds in their ears, they were unknowingly witnessing the start of something even bigger. The iPod was only the beginning of Apple's rise into becoming one of the most influential companies in history. By the mid-2000s, Apple was already riding high on the success of the iPod. Millions of people carried one in their pocket, and Apple was no longer just a computer company, it was a cultural force. But Steve Jobs was not satisfied. He knew technology was moving toward a new frontier, the phone. At the time, cell phones were everywhere, but they were clunky, confusing, and uninspired. They were good for calls and text messages, but browsing the web or using apps felt frustrating. Some phones had small keyboards, others used styluses, but none felt truly intuitive. Jobs saw an opportunity. He believed the phone could be reinvented. In January 2007, on a stage in San Francisco, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone. Holding it in his hand, he told the audience, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." And he was right. The iPhone combined a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator all in one sleek device. But the real magic was the touchscreen. With a swipe of a finger, you could scroll, zoom, and tap, no buttons, no stylus, just your hand. It felt natural, almost magical. The audience gasped as Jobs demonstrated. Pinching to zoom, scrolling with ease, switching between music and calls, it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. And yet, it felt obvious, as though this was the way phones should have always worked. The iPhone didn't just launch a new product, it launched a new era. It became the foundation for the modern smartphone, a device that billions of people around the world now rely on every day. It changed how we communicate, how we work, how we live. But beyond the technology, the iPhone represented Steve Jobs' philosophy at its peak: simplicity, elegance, and human connection. He once said that design is not just what something looks like, but how it works. The iPhone embodied that belief. It was powerful yet simple, advanced yet accessible. The cultural impact was immediate. Lines stretched outside Apple stores. People camped overnight just to be among the first to own one. The iPhone wasn't just a tool, it was a status symbol, a piece of the future in your pocket. Looking back, the iPhone was more than a product launch. It was a turning point in history. It reshaped industries, from communication to photography, from music to business. And it showed the world that technology, when done right, could feel less like a machine and more like an extension of who we are. The lesson of the iPhone is this: true visionaries don't just see what people want today, they imagine what people will need tomorrow. Steve Jobs didn't just improve the phone. He redefined it, and in doing so, he redefined how humanity connects. By the mid-2000s, Apple was already riding high on the success of the iPod. Millions of people carried one in their pocket, and Apple was no longer just a computer company, it was a cultural force. But Steve Jobs was not satisfied. He knew technology was moving toward a new frontier, the phone. At the time, cell phones were everywhere, but they were clunky, confusing, and uninspired. They were good for calls and text messages, but browsing the web or using apps felt frustrating. Some phones had small keyboards, others used styluses, but none felt truly intuitive. Jobs saw an opportunity. He believed the phone could be reinvented. In January 2007, on a stage in San Francisco, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone. Holding it in his hand, he told the audience, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." And he was right. The iPhone combined a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator all in one sleek device. But the real magic was the touchscreen. With a swipe of a finger, you could scroll, zoom, and tap, no buttons, no stylus, just your hand. It felt natural, almost magical. The audience gasped as Jobs demonstrated. Pinching to zoom, scrolling with ease, switching between music and calls, it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. And yet, it felt obvious, as though this was the way phones should have always worked. The iPhone didn't just launch a new product, it launched a new era. It became the foundation for the modern smartphone, a device that billions of people around the world now rely on every day. It changed how we communicate, how we work, how we live. But beyond the technology, the iPhone represented Steve Jobs' philosophy at its peak: simplicity, elegance, and human connection. He once said that design is not just what something looks like, but how it works. The iPhone embodied that belief. It was powerful yet simple, advanced yet accessible. The cultural impact was immediate. Lines stretched outside Apple stores. People camped overnight just to be among the first to own one. The iPhone wasn't just a tool, it was a status symbol, a piece of the future in your pocket. Looking back, the iPhone was more than a product launch. It was a turning point in history. It reshaped industries, from communication to photography, from music to business. And it showed the world that technology, when done right, could feel less like a machine and more like an extension of who we are. The lesson of the iPhone is this: true visionaries don't just see what people want today, they imagine what people will need tomorrow. Steve Jobs didn't just improve the phone. He redefined it, and in doing so, he redefined how humanity connects.